There are mornings a man remembers so clear it hurts, like pressing a thumb into a bruise just to know it's still there. The morning she arrived was one of those. I was 53 years old and had spent the better part of my life building something worth looking at. The Whitaker spread sat on 400 acres of Wyoming grassland, east of the Laramie Range, where the light in autumn turns the whole valley, the color of a penny, held up to the sun. I had a white-painted house with actual glass windows, a proper parlor with a settee shipped up from Denver, an oak dining table long enough to seat 12 men comfortably, which I had purchased with the specific intention of impressing 12 specific men. Railroad men, investors, the sort of fellows who decided which way progress would run through a territory. They were coming in October. It was late August now, and I had arranged everything. The house was clean, the books were balanced, and I had sent for a bride. That last detail had not been my first instinct. I was a practical man, or so I believed. But my neighbor Bert Haggerty had mentioned, over a bottle of decent rye, that the railroad men brought their wives to meetings of consequence, and that a man entertaining alone read as a man with no roots. A man with no roots was a man you did not lend money to. I had taken that advice the way I took most practical advice, quietly and immediately. I wrote to an agency in St. Louis. I asked for a woman of education and refinement. I listed my requirements without embarrassment. She should be comfortable at a formal table, capable of polite conversation, presentable in appearance, and ideally familiar with the domestic arts of the more cultivated variety. I wrote that phrase myself, the more cultivated variety, and I was quite satisfied with it. What I received in return was a letter from a woman who described herself as industrious, cheerful, and experienced in livestock management. She had also, the letter noted in a postscript so small I nearly missed it, a small number of dairy animals she would bring along, as they were her livelihood, and she could not part with them. I told myself a small number meant one, possibly two. The morning she arrived, I stood at the edge of my drive in my good coat watching the wagon come down the road from town. The driver, old Pete Svensson, who hauled freight and had no particular feelings about anything, was perched up top with an expression on his face I had never seen before, something between amusement and apology. Behind the wagon seat, stacked and tied and smelling powerfully of the countryside, were wooden crates, milk pails, and objects I could not immediately name. Around the wagon, trotting with the cheerful confidence of creatures who owned the earth, were 6 goats. And seated among the crates, straight-backed as a schoolteacher, was the woman. She was waving at me already, like we were old friends. I will tell you that I had imagined this moment many times in the weeks prior. In my imagining, a composed and presentable woman stepped down from the wagon, accepted my hand, remarked favorably on the view of the mountains, and we walked together toward the house while Pete Svensson unloaded a modest collection of luggage. In my imagining, my nearest neighbor, Harding, happened to be riding past the gate and witnessed the whole thing with an envious eye. What actually happened was this. The wagon had barely rolled to a stop before she was on her feet among the crates, not waiting for assistance, calling out something in a language I did not speak to the goats, who answered her with enormous enthusiasm. Pete climbed down from the box, looking relieved to have arrived alive. The 6 goats, freed from whatever loose arrangement had kept them roughly near the wagon, spread across my gravel drive like a small invasion. One of them walked directly to the ornamental juniper I had planted beside the front gate and began eating it with great contentment. She dropped to the ground, dusted her skirt twice with her palms, and looked up at me with brown eyes that were entirely unbothered by the chaos. Surrounding her, she smiled. It was not a nervous smile or an apologetic smile. It was the smile of a woman who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. She said my name, mispronouncing it slightly, and then said something in German-accented English about the journey being very fine and the mountains being even better than she had expected. I said, "Those are 6 goats." She looked at them as though counting, which was unnecessary, and agreed that yes, they were 6. Then she said something about the seventh having been sold before departure, as 7 was too many, and her expression suggested I ought to feel grateful for her restraint. I did not feel grateful. I felt the particular cold sensation of a man watching a plan come apart in public, because Harding was, in fact, riding past the gate. He had slowed to a stop, he was watching, and he was not envious. She, meanwhile, had already turned back to the wagon and was speaking to Pete about the careful unloading of a wooden crate that, from its odor, contained equipment of a dairy nature. She directed him with the ease of a woman accustomed to being obeyed, and Pete, a man who took direction from no one living, was doing exactly as she said. I stood on my own drive in my good coat, with a goat eating my juniper behind me, and another goat investigating the hem of my trousers with serious intent, and I watched Harding ride away toward town, and I understood with terrible clarity that by supper time, every man in the county would know exactly what had stepped off Pete Svensson's wagon that morning. She turned around then, holding a large cheese mold in both arms, and asked me cheerfully where she should put the dairy things. I told her to put the dairy things in the barn. I said it the way a man says something when he has no better answer and cannot afford to stand silent. The barn was the only structure on the property, large enough to hold equipment I had not yet seen the full extent of, and it had the advantage of being away from the house, where Harding could not have seen it from the road. That last part was a foolish thought. The damage from the road was already done. She thanked me pleasantly and turned back to the wagon, and I walked into my house and stood in the front parlor among the good furniture I had ordered from Cheyenne and looked at the room the way you look, at something you have been proud of and are suddenly uncertain about. The settee, the imported wool rug, the glass-fronted cabinet where I kept the 2 pieces of china that had survived the trip from St. Louis. I had imagined a woman standing in this room who would understand immediately what I had built here and what I intended it to become. A woman who would add to it, refine it, speak well to Harding and the others over a proper supper table. I heard from the direction of the barn the sound of goats. Not distressed goats, content ones. There is a difference, and a man learns it faster than he expects to. These were making the low, rolling sound of animals being settled properly into a space by someone who knew what she was doing. I could hear her voice underneath it, speaking to them in what I assumed was her own language, some short and sensible words that had the rhythm of instruction rather than sentiment. I went to the window that faced the barn. I could see Pete carrying the wooden crate she had directed him toward, and I could see her walking the perimeter of the barn's outer fence the way a man walks new ground, studying it, measuring it in her mind. She stopped at the south corner where the fence post had been leaning since April, the one I had not gotten around to resetting, and she put her hand on it and gave it a deliberate push and watched how it moved. Then she looked at the post beside it, then at the ground. She was assessing my fence, my neglected fence, which I had not troubled to fix because the cattle grazed the upper pasture. And the barn lot was rarely used, and I had intended to address it before winter. She was standing there in her traveling dress, cataloging my oversights, and she did not look critical about it. She looked practical. She looked like a woman making a list. That was in some ways worse. I stepped back from the window. I needed to think. I needed to consider how this situation might yet be managed, how Harding might be addressed, what could reasonably be said at the next meeting of the Land Association when the questions began, and they would begin. I went to make coffee, which was the only sensible thing I could think of. The coffee was bitter that morning. I had let it sit too long on the stove while my thoughts ran in circles, and when I poured it out and took the first sip, it matched my mood precisely, dark and unpleasant and of my own making. I heard her before I saw her. Not a knock at the door, but a sound from the side yard, a kind of low, patient coaxing, the sort of voice you use with animals when you want their cooperation rather than their panic. I set the cup down and looked out the kitchen window. She had found the lean to where I stored odds and ends, old fence wire, a broken hay rake, two barrels I had no particular use for. She was dragging one of those barrels out into the yard with considerable effort and no complaint. The goats watched her with that unnerving alertness goats have, like small professors attending a lecture. She positioned the barrel, examined it, then walked back to the lean-to and returned with a length of old rope. She was building something, or arranging something. I could not yet tell which. I went outside, not because I wished to engage with the project, but because a man cannot stand in his own kitchen watching through a window without losing some essential portion of his dignity. She looked up when I appeared, cheerful as a woman who had slept well and harbored no grievances. "Good morning," she said. "I hope I am not in the way of your work." "What are you doing with that barrel?" I asked. "Making a stand," she said simply, "for the milking. It is easier on the back, and it keeps the goats calmer when they are elevated a little. They feel settled. Do you have a board? Perhaps 1 foot wide and 3 feet long?" I had such a board. I had several. They were stacked in the barn behind the broken cultivator, and I had not thought of them in 2 years. I retrieved one without saying much about it. She thanked me with the brisk efficiency of someone who had expected the answer to be yes, and was pleased to be proven right. Within 20 minutes, she had fashioned a rudimentary milking platform from the barrel and board, lashed together with my old rope, and she was demonstrating its stability by pressing her full weight against it with both hands while the first of the goats climbed on with the confidence of an animal who had done this 1,000 times. I stood and watched. There was nothing else to do. She milked with economy and speed, her hands working in that practiced rhythm that cannot be faked and cannot be taught quickly. The milk came down clean and steady into a tin pail she had produced from among her things. When she was done with the first goat, she set the pail aside with care and brought up the second. I thought about the railroad men. I thought about what Harding would say when he heard about the barrel. And I went back inside to pour out the cold coffee and start fresh. That evening she asked me where she might store the milk overnight, and I told her the cellar beneath the kitchen was the coolest place on the property. She nodded, carried both pails down the narrow steps without spilling a drop, and came back up, brushing her hands on her apron, as though the matter were entirely settled. I had half expected her to complain about the cellar. It was dark and low-ceilinged and smelled of old turnips, but she did not complain. She simply adapted, the way water adapts to whatever vessel it finds itself in. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my room thinking about the railroad men and the visit scheduled for the following Friday, and the longer I lay there, the more the week ahead felt like a gauntlet I had already failed to run. The goats were penned in my best fenced garden enclosure because she had identified it as the most secure structure on the property, and she was not wrong, but by morning they had eaten the ornamental juniper I had planted specifically because the land agent's wife had told me refined families kept ornamental junipers. I stood at the garden gate, looked at the ruined shrub, and felt something close to grief for a future I had been trying very hard to construct. She came out with a tin cup of coffee for me before I had time to say anything about the juniper. The coffee was better than mine. I did not remark on that either. What I did remark on 2 days later was the smell. Not an unpleasant smell. I want to be precise about this. It was something sharp and clean, faintly sour, the way certain mornings in high country smell when the air carries something mineral and alive. I followed it to the cellar stairs and found that she had commandeered my second best work table, the one I kept for mending harness, and arranged upon it 4 of the shallow, round molds she had carried from the wagon. Each one held a pale disk of something pressed and setting. She was bent over them with the focused attention of someone reading a very small print. I asked her what she was making. She straightened and looked at me with that expression she sometimes wore. Patient. but with a quality underneath it that suggested she had already answered this question several times in her life and had made a kind of peace with answering it again. Cheese, she said, the real kind, the kind that keeps. I looked at the molds. I looked at the cellar's stone walls, which were, I realized, nearly the same temperature as the caves she had likely worked in before she ever boarded a ship to cross an ocean and end up in my garden eating my junipers. I thought about the railroad men and their white shirts and their opinions about suitable investments. Then I thought about the word keeps. I went back upstairs and did not say anything further. But I thought about that word for the rest of the day. The cheese aged in that cellar for 3 weeks before she declared any of it ready. I know the number because I count it in the way a man counts things he pretends not to be watching. During those 3 weeks, she did not slow down. She had by then arranged a proper rotation with the goats, morning and evening milking, carried out with a calm efficiency that made the animals cooperative in a way I had never seen animals be cooperative with anyone. I had assumed goats were, by their nature, contrary creatures. I had based this assumption on every goat I had ever encountered. She seemed to operate under a different assumption entirely, and the goats, apparently, had read her version of events. She also began asking me questions about the ranch's accounts, not in a challenging way. She would simply appear beside me at the table in the evening, look at what I was writing, and ask quiet questions about the grazing leases, about the cost of freighting goods to the nearest town, about which merchants there dealt in specialty goods for the hotel trade. I was guarded at first. A man in my position learns guardedness the way he learns to check the sky before haying. But she listened to the answers with the same focused attention she gave the cheese molds, and she did not offer opinions unless I asked. And when I did ask, the opinions were worth hearing. It was during one of these evenings that I told her, for the first time honestly, how close to the edge things stood. The railroad investment I had been counting on had not materialized. Two neighboring ranchers had already sold portions of their land to cover debt. My own cattle numbers were down from the dry summer, and the winter feed costs were going to be steep. I had not said this aloud to anyone. I said it to her the way you say a thing you have been carrying a long time. Not because you expect a solution, but because the weight of it has finally become more than one set of shoulders can hold. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me how many merchants were in the hotel district of Cheyenne. I told her what I knew. She nodded slowly, looking at the table rather than at me, turning something over in her mind. Then she said that in the valley she had come from, in the canton where she had grown up, cheese had been the thing that kept families when cattle did not. That a single wheel of properly aged cheese, the kind with a name and a reputation, could command a price in the right market that would surprise a man who had only ever thought of cheese as something you bought at a general store. I thought about the 4 molds in my cellar. I thought about 6 goats in my garden. Then I thought about the word reputation and how a ranch could have one, or fail to. Outside, the first hard frost of the season silvered the grass, and somewhere in the dark, a goat shifted in its pen and was quiet. That word stayed with me through the night. Reputation. I had built mine, or tried to, on straight fence lines and a clean herd book and the kind of handshake that men remembered. I had imagined it attached to something large. The acreage, the cattle count, the house with its painted trim. I had not imagined it attached to a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth and wax. But she was already thinking further ahead than I was. By morning she had a list. Not a wish list, not a dreamer's list, but a working list, written on the back of an envelope in her small, careful hand, the kind of hand that had learned its letters in a schoolroom where ink was not wasted. She showed it to me over breakfast. There were names on it. The hotel she had heard mentioned, a restaurant that had opened in Cheyenne the previous spring, a dry goods merchant who she believed took specialty items on consignment. Beside each name, she had written a question, not a statement of what she wanted, but a question about what they needed. I read it twice. I told her I did not know how she had come by half this information. She said she listened when men talked at the general store, and that men at a general store assumed a woman buying flour was not paying attention to anything else. I had no answer for that. She told me her plan was simple. She would age 2 wheels through the winter, the ones already in the mold, and one of them she would enter in the Territorial Agricultural Fair in the spring. Not to win a ribbon, though she did not say she would refuse one. She wanted a name on a card about beside a wheel of cheese in a glass case, in a room where buyers walked. She wanted a name that people could ask for. I told her the fair was also attended by the sort of men who had laughed at my expense in October, and that I was not certain I was eager to give them another opportunity. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not learned to read yet, though I would in time. She said that those men were going to need to eat the same as everyone else, and that she did not especially require their admiration, only their money. I found to my own surprise that I laughed. It was not a thing I had done much in recent years. The sound of it felt unfamiliar in the kitchen, like a tool pulled from the back of a drawer after a long winter. She did not make a great deal of it. She simply smiled at her list and turned it right side up again. We began that week. Small things at first. She showed me how the aging required a consistent temperature, and we spent 2 cold afternoons reinforcing the cellar door against drafts. The goats, for once, were neither the problem nor the joke. They were, it was beginning to appear, the beginning of something. The week before the fair, she asked me to help her carry the first finished wheels up from the cellar. I had been down there plenty of times by then, checking the temperature, making certain the drafts we had sealed stayed sealed, but I had not handled the cheeses much myself. She placed one in my arms the way you might hand a man something fragile, and I understood why when I felt the weight of it. Solid, dense. It had a rind the color of old saddle leather and a smell that was sharp and clean at once, like cold stone and something alive beneath it. She said it was ready. I did not know enough to argue, and I was learning that I did not need to. We wrapped them in cloth and packed them in the flatbed with straw between, and I watched her check every one twice before she was satisfied. She had made 7 wheels in total. 2 she set aside without explanation. The other 5 went into the wagon. When I asked about the 2 she had kept back, she said simply that those were not for selling. She said it in the same tone a person uses when something has already been decided and the deciding is not up for discussion. I had begun to recognize that tone as well. The morning of the fair was gray and cold, in the way that February mornings in Wyoming are gray and cold, which is to say completely without apology. The road into town was hard and rutted, and the wagon moved slowly. She sat beside me on the bench, wrapped in her heavy coat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not seem especially nervous. I was nervous enough for both of us, though I would not have admitted it then. I had told myself, in the weeks of preparation, that I did not care what those men thought. I had told myself this several times in several different ways, which is usually a sign that a man cares considerably. The memory of their laughter in October had not entirely left me. It had gone quiet, the way a sore goes quiet when you stop pressing on it, but it was there. She must have sensed something in the way I held the reins, because she said, without looking at me, that whatever happened at the fair was only one fair. She said there would be others. She said it the way a person states a fact about the weather, not as comfort exactly, but as information she considered relevant. I thought about that for a mile or so. By the time we reached the edge of town, I had decided she was right, as she had a reliable habit of being. What would happen at the fair would happen. I had brought 5 wheels of cheese and a woman who had made them out of the very animals that had made me a laughingstock, and there was something in that equation I could not quite name but could feel sitting solidly in my chest. We pulled onto the main street just as the first stalls were going up. The fair grounds sat at the south end of town, where the street widened into a kind of flat common ground that served as a marketplace, a gathering place, and, on occasion, a place for arguments to be settled, with nothing more violent than loud voices and competitive livestock. I had been to this fair before, in better years, when the ranch had felt like something worth being proud of. I had not attended in the last 2 seasons, and I was aware, as we pulled in, that people would notice. They did. I felt the looks before I could name them, the particular way a small town watches a man who has been the subject of its humor reassert himself in a public space. A few men near the grain stalls tracked the wagon without turning their heads, fully the way a dog watches a stranger from the corner of its eye. I kept my posture easy. I had practiced that on the drive in. She was looking at everything with the open interest of a person who finds the world genuinely worth examining. She noted the ribbon displays, the pie tables, the rows of jarred preserves catching the autumn light. She remarked that the quilt hanging on the far fence was a double wedding, ring pattern, and that someone had done exceptionally careful work with the corners. I had not noticed the quilt. I would not have noticed the quilt if I had been given a week. We found a table near the eastern edge of the food pavilion, between a woman selling apple butter and a man with an arrangement of dried beans that seemed optimistic in their presentation. I set the wooden cakes down and began arranging the wheels while she spread the cloth we had brought. A plain cream linen, nothing fancy, which is what I had expected. She had pressed it the night before, and it fell flat and smooth. The wheels looked well. I had to admit that privately, as a man admits something that pleases him more than he intended. The wax was the dark amber color that meant age and care, and she had tied small labels to each one in her neat slanted hand, noting the variety and the month of making. It seemed unnecessary to me at the time. It would not seem unnecessary later. Within the first quarter hour, a woman from the hotel in Laramie stopped and looked. She picked up one of the labels and read it carefully, the way a person reads a document they intend to hold someone to. She asked who had made it. I was prepared to answer, but she had already turned toward her. I watched her explain it simply and without performance. The breed, the milk, the aging, the cellar temperature she maintained through summer. The hotel woman listened the way people listen when they are calculating something. She asked to try a piece. She cut a thin wedge with the small knife she kept in her apron pocket and set it on a piece of brown paper for the woman to taste. I noticed she did not rush this. She waited while the hotel woman brought it to her mouth, and she watched, not anxiously, but with the particular stillness of someone who already knows what is inside a thing and is simply allowing another person to discover it for themselves. The hotel woman did not speak right away. That told me something. People who are unimpressed speak immediately. She asked how many wheels were available. She asked about the harder variety, the one pressed longer, with the darker rind. She asked whether a regular arrangement could be made, a delivery, perhaps monthly, to the hotel kitchen. I was standing close enough to hear all of this, and I will tell you honestly that I did not move or speak. I was afraid that if I did either, something would shift and the moment would close like door on a windy day before you can catch it. She answered each question evenly. She told the woman what was currently available and what the seller could reliably produce once the second herd had settled into full milk. She named a price per wheel. It was not an apologetic price. It was the price of a woman who had calculated her costs and her labor and had added a fair margin on top because she understood what she was making and did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. The hotel woman agreed without negotiating. That was the moment I understood something had changed, though I could not yet have told you precisely what. She bought 4 wheels before the morning was half over. She said she would return in the afternoon with her husband, who managed the hotel accounts, to discuss the monthly arrangement. After she moved on, I came to stand beside her at the table. I did not say anything useful. I said something about the weather holding, which was the sort of thing a man says when he wants to speak and cannot locate the right words. She straightened one of the remaining labels that had tilted slightly and did not look up from it when she answered me. She said the hotel woman would tell others. She said that was always the way with good cheese. You did not advertise it. You simply let the first person who found it do the work for you. Then she smiled at the wheel she was adjusting, not at me, and there was a satisfaction in it that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with a plan coming true the way a plan does when it was built on honest foundations. By midday, the table was half empty, and 3 other buyers had asked for her name and the name of the ranch. Those 3 buyers became 5 before the wagon was loaded for the return trip. She had brought a small ledger, a plain brown thing she kept in her apron pocket, and she wrote each name and each order in it with a pencil stub. She sharpened with her pocket knife between entries. I watched her do it, and understood that she had been keeping accounts long before she ever came to Wyoming. This was not a woman learning a trade. This was a woman who had been practicing one her entire life and had simply been waiting for ground firm enough to stand on while she worked it. We rode home with an empty table and a full ledger, and I held the reins without much need to, because the horses knew the road, and I was not really driving so much as sitting and thinking. She did not fill the silence with conversation. She watched the grass moving along the roadside and occasionally made a small note in her ledger. And the scratch of the pencil was the only sound between us for a good long while. I thought about what the hotel woman had said. She had not called the cheese fine or acceptable. She had said it was remarkable. She had said it the way a person says something they did not expect to say, as though the word had surprised them on its way out of their mouth. I had not expected remarkable. I had expected manageable. I had expected the situation to become something I could explain to the investors without embarrassment, something I could point to and say, well, it was unconventional, but it turned a modest profit. I had not expected to be sitting in a wagon beside a woman who had just quietly sold half a season's worth of inventory on a single morning and written every detail of it into a ledger without once raising her voice or making a single promise she could not keep. When we reached the upper pasture gate, I got down to open it, and the goats came to the fence line the way they always did when they heard the wagon. She leaned over the side and spoke to them, something low and Swiss and entirely between herself and the animals, and they pressed their heads against the fence rails, and she scratched the nearest one behind the ear without interrupting whatever she was saying. I latched the gate behind us and climbed back up, and we went on toward the barn. That evening she set the ledger on the table after supper and opened it and went through each entry quietly while I sat across from her with the lamp between us. The numbers she read were not modest. They were the kind of numbers that change the shape of a year. She said nothing dramatic about them. She simply read them and then looked up at me and waited, the pencil resting in her fingers, to see if I had any questions. I had questions. I had plenty of them. But when I looked at her across that lamplit table, the pencil resting easy in her fingers, her eyes patient and clear, I found that not one of them was about the numbers. I asked her instead if she was glad she had come. She considered it the way she considered everything, without rush. Then she said yes. She said the land had surprised her. She said the winters were harder than she had expected, and the summers shorter, and the neighbors farther apart than anything she had known in the valley where she grew up. But she said the goats had settled in well, and the grass in the upper pasture was better than she had hoped, and the light in the mornings, when it came over the eastern ridge and touched the whole yard gold before anything else was awake. That light, she said, was something she had not been prepared for, something she had not read about in any letter. I told her I had not thought to mention it. She smiled at that and closed the ledger. We were married the following April, quiet in the front room, with the windows open and the smell of the pasture coming in on a warm wind. The goats could be heard from the yard, which struck the minister as irregular, but he was gracious about it. I will not pretend the years that followed were without their hard seasons. There were dry years and wet years, and one winter so long it seemed to have no intention of ending. We lost two channels to a late freeze and a section of fence to a runoff that came down harder than any we had seen. There were mornings I rose before dawn, with a weight on me that had no clean name. But she was always there at the stove when I came in, the lamp already burning, and she would hand me a cup without a word and stand beside me at the window while the yard came slowly into the light. And that was enough. That was, I have come to understand, more than most men are given. The cheese went on selling. The ledger went on filling. The ranch that everyone in that county had quietly written off as a handsome failure became something else entirely, something that fed people, employed people, sent its name out across the territory on the labels of small waxed rounds packed in wooden crates. But what I remember most, when I sit here now with the years all settled behind me, is not the ledger or the buyers or any of it. I remember a woman leaning over the side of a wagon on a September morning, speaking softly to six goats in a language I never learned, and the way she looked up at me after and asked with her eyes if I was ready to go home. I was.